Hello, welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you with us. And we have a special show today, but I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest, actually in the state of Washington. I've written some books. My latest book is In the House of Tom Bombadil, and I'm working on a commentary in the book of Acts. Enough about me. How about you, Tom?
I'm Tom Price. I teach theology, ethics, and philosophy. One of the places is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary.
And then on to you, Glenn.
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I am a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, ministry associate at Reflections Ministries, and a retired history professor.
And by the way, we have a live audience in Huntsville, Alabama. Glenn Sunshine is going to serve as our master of ceremonies, so to speak, and take it from here. We've got a special guest. And so, Glenn, why don't you introduce him? And then let's get into the subject of the day, because I know our special guest has a limited time frame to work with. Okay,
so we've got Max McLean on today. Max is the founder of the Fellowship for Performing Arts. He's the genius behind a number of stage plays based on C.S. Lewis's work, Screwtape Letters, Great Divorce, and others. Martin Luther on Trial, whole variety of things. And most recently, a film, The Most Reluctant Convert, based on a stage play, but then really interesting adaptation for film. So Max, welcome aboard. Really glad to have you.
Thank you.
Okay, just to start off, tell us about the Fellowship of the Performing Arts. When did you start it? Why did you start it? What's your goal with that?
Yeah. Our mission is we're a New York City theatrical production company that produces theater and now film from a Christian worldview meant to engage a diverse audience. And by diverse, we mean intellectually diverse, religiously diverse, which are, I guess, are the only kind of diversity that's not allowed, and so that's what we do. And the focus recently, with that as a mission, and of course it would be, is we focused on a lot of Lewis's work. Screwtape Letters, The First Great Divorce, Most Reluctant Convert, and we're continuing in that vein.
So, what caught your attention about Lewis? How did you start getting engaged with him?
Right. Well, I'm an adult convert to Christianity in my 20s, read the New Testament thoroughly, and actually just once, I guess I had eyes to see and ears to hear, I really just was captured by it in such a huge way. And then I was introduced to Lewis. I think the first one that really grabbed my attention was the Screwtape Letters. And it was actually the very first letter. You might remember it, when Screwtape is kind of bragging about his past successes. And he mentions a man in the British Museum who was reading something, and all of a sudden he sees 20 years' work beginning to totter. And so he said, but he was, and he said that he was no such fool. He acted instantly on the part of the man he had best under control and said, isn't it just about time for lunch? And all of a sudden got him out of the moment. And Screwtape's enemy, God, says to the man, this is more important than lunch. And Screwtape responds by saying, yes, far too important to tackle at the end of a morning. Why don't you come back after lunch with a fresh mind? And so the man gets up and he goes down, picks up a newspaper, gets on a bus, and that huge catastrophe in Screwtape's mind is averted, and Screwtape says, kind of in a whoosh sort of way, this man is now safely in our Father's house, and he'd forgotten. He said he realized all this sort of stuff just can't possibly be true. And he ends that by saying, it's funny how these humans picture us as putting things into their minds. Our best work is done by keeping things out. And I think that's a real insight. And when I read that, particularly that first letter, I just knew I understood spiritual warfare in a way I hadn't understood it before, in a very real, everyday way, on how every moment of life is a possibility to do the right thing or the wrong thing. and the whole trajectory of your life can change instantaneously. So that's how Lewis first captured my attention.
Right.
Yeah, and of course, the first play that I'm aware of that you did was based on Screwtape, which, by the way, I saw in Boston, was magnificent.
Yes, we love doing Screwtape. It's a very, very challenging play. It's tough play, but it's thankfully one of the most popular plays. I do think that Screwtape is, for an adult, I still think Screwtape is perhaps the best introduction to Lewis. First of all, it's incredibly biographical in the sense that he himself is the subject of the attacks. He's the model for the patient, and Lewis said that it was the easiest thing he ever wrote, but the least enjoyable.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, sometimes, acting or also writing, it's kind of enjoyable to write malevolent characters or evil characters because they have such a, I guess, easy sort of, it's kind of an easier time portraying evil than good. Because I think I heard
evil sort of does engender conflict.
Right.
And you want to oppose it. But I think it was Simone Weil that said something that really has struck my attention. I got this from Malcolm Muggeridge in a lecture that I was surprised to get a hold of. He said literary evil is so interesting and so fascinating, where evil in reality is so bland and ugly. And so there's a very interesting thing that what does literature do to reality?
Yeah.
And what does art do to reality?
Right.
In the process of enlightening, of magnifying what is being said, it can do some distortion as well.
Right. Those are some great thoughts.
Yeah, Lewis said that he had wanted to write the other side of it, the perspective of a guardian angel, but he was incapable of doing it. He could not imagine what that looked like.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah, he couldn't get that far. I was talking to somebody recently, that Claire Booth Luce, the wife of Henry Luce, owner of Time Life in the 30s, she had a religious experience that prompted her to read Screwtape Letters, and then she immediately contacted Lewis, and actually she bought the rights to do the film back in the 30s. The film's never been made, and I believe that there's reasons for that. But in a letter that was discovered in a biography of Claire Booth Luce, she asked Lewis for advice on making the movie. And Lewis says, well, I don't really go in for these things, but if you're going to do it, I suggest the following. Make sure that you don't make Screwtape a comic character. Make sure all your angels are males. And make sure the music that you use is discordant. And those were the three things that he suggested to Claire Booth Luce in moving in making the movie of Screwtape, which never got made.
Yeah.
Well, I remember walking into the theater to see Screwtape, and the music that was playing was the Stones' "Sympathy for the Devil," which I thought was absolutely brilliant. But
yeah, some of our younger listeners are going to be looking for that now, Glenn.
I think it's so. I was gonna say really quickly. I think I remember reading Lewis talking about the kind of darkness that he underwent when he was creating that character, and how he had to also kind of distance himself from it because it tended to take over too easily. And I don't know if you ran across that or in your studies and preparation.
Yeah, I think that's right. He said it was the easiest thing he ever wrote, the least enjoyable. It was all dust and itch and scratch, and all semblances of goodness and joy had to be written out. And he said it was fun at first, but it got really tedious very, very quickly. And of course, when you think of it as being autobiographical, then it becomes a little bit of a confessional, a little bit of a purging. He was seeing a spiritual director at that time. So I think all these things coalesced. And of course, that was kind of the period of his great ascendancy onto the public domain in terms of, I think he had signed the contract to do the broadcast talks, but he hadn't done them yet. But he'd already started writing the Screwtape Letters in serial form. And then that was published together as a book. And I think there was 8 printings in his first year. It was astonishing. Introduced him to America. And, royalties poured in, which he thought was another temptation. So it was a time of great public growth in terms of his notoriety.
Yeah, if I remember right, he dedicated it to Tolkien, and Tolkien was absolutely horrified.
Yeah, he didn't like the book. He didn't like the book at all. It was almost as if I'll show you.
He says in The Lord of the Rings that it's dangerous to look too closely into the workings of the enemy because they can ensnare you. And he thought that this was getting really close to that.
I think he was. I mean, any reading of it is very convicting, very, very convicting, and that's why I think it's so important. It is a devotional, but it's a kind of a reverse devotional, because you don't really think about things in that side. Whereas The Great Divorce, on the other hand, which I think is an equally powerful piece, it's actually showing spiritual warfare from the heavenly perspective on how we resist the Holy Spirit. Is how we we count the cost and think the cost is too high.
Speaking of
The Great Divorce is actually my favorite short piece by Lewis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
strong.
Yeah, I love it too. Speaking of cost, Lewis, brilliant, great scholar, was kept from advancing in his academic career at Oxford. And I recall reading kind of a quip in which one of the people who had voted against his getting a chair said it was he said the reason was Screwtape. He could not support the man in his academic career who had written Screw. Of course, in academe, being popular outside of academia is like strike against you.
Yes, yeah.
Right.
That's not what we should be doing with our free time.
Right.
And of course, by that time, he was offered a chair to Cambridge, and got it. And as soon as he was offered a chair to Cambridge, then Oxford offered him a chair to stay. But he'd already made his commitment to Cambridge and stuck with it.
Yeah. So moving to The Most Reluctant Convert. For people who haven't read Surprised by Joy or seen the film or the play, where does the title come from? How did that come about?
Yeah. Well, the Surprised by Joy is an origin story about how a man who was a vigorous debunker of Christianity, really hated it, did not want it to be true, went from that to becoming, as he said, the most reluctant convert in all England, most dejected, reluctant convert in all England. That's the arc of the story, and it took many years. It started with the death of his mother at age 9. She was the rock that held the family together. He had a terrible relationship with his father, and the relationship got worse when his mother died. He experienced the butchery of trench warfare in World War I. Came to the conclusion either there's no God behind the universe, a God indifferent to good and evil, or worse, an evil God. And that was the starting point of his intellectual journey to Christianity, which took 10 and 12 years. And to cut it short, it would be, what turned him around? Well, certainly the relationship he had with key friends such as Tolkien and Barfield, Owen Barfield, J.R. Tolkien, Hugo Dyson, and others. and probably at the core of it was that his argument against God was that the universe was so cruel and unjust. But where had he got this notion of cruel and unjust? We call a line crooked because you have some idea of a straight line. What are you comparing the universe with when you call it cruel and unjust? If the universe has no meaning, we would never know it has no meaning. So that kind of turned his head, and so he kind of made a slight move to what was known as idealism. But he thought, well, that's a good place to be because that God won't do anything to you. It won't come down here and make a nuisance of itself, which I think was kind of interesting. It was kind of a tame God,
right?
To use Narnia language, but in time, through various individual instances, it came to the point where he could not deny the reality of the theistic God. I mean, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is kind of interesting that his conversion was really the conversion that we sort of often think of, a moral conversion, a repentance, a turning around and taking a moral inventory and saying, I don't measure up. We usually think of that in Christian terms. But Lewis did not do that from a Christian perspective. He did it from what he called a theistic perspective, more like Moses at the burning bush, being confronted by the consuming fire. And that was his starting point on the road to Christ. But in the beginning, he said he had no conception of the incarnation. The God to whom he surrendered was not human. He simply couldn't understand how the life and death of someone else, whoever he was 2,000 years ago, could help him here now. And so that actually changed with a very well-known conversation with J.R. Tolkien at Addison's Walk.
Now, in the opening of the film, there's this marvelous monologue with you, and you are giving the arguments against God.
Yeah.
And it's been a while since I've read Surprised by Joy. Is that taken from Surprised by Joy? Is that something you?
No, that comes from the opening chapter, The Problem of Pain.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. That particular section comes that we call it our prologue, when he gives a very devastating critique of not just Christianity, but the existence of a good and moral God. That the idea that the universe is righteous and just, because our experience of the universe is not righteous and just.
I thought that was a brilliant way to begin it, because you start with the strongest argument right away against it, and then you just sort of show the slow transformation, how this really doesn't hold up. I thought that was really well done. I loved the writing on, just in terms of the structure.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it certainly separates the sheep from the wolves in terms of, okay, I'm into this or I'm not, but I think a lot of people that know Lewis, they want to hear his words, and right. We really wanted to give an experience of sitting with Lewis, hearing his language, hearing his syntax, how he articulates a thought. He said something, one of his I think it was in God in the Dock, where he says that people do enjoy a logical stream of thought, logical arguments, because I think he says the brain is meant to do that. But he says one of the reasons they like it is because they don't do it very often. And so when you can give person, and as long as they can follow it, I think that's the key thing. If you can follow it and you're having the experience of following it, it's really, it really tickles the brain, when you're doing that. So, and Lewis knew that. And so that's how he structured his arguments. And so what we try to do is what the big test of the film was whether or not that would translate to film. Mm-hmm. Because, film, unlike theater, the imprint is the voice. And it's still about the word, where film has really gravitated much, much towards the image. And so words have become less and less important to the telling of the story. And of course, if you get accustomed to that when you go to the film, and you get accustomed to that, then our film strikes one as completely different.
Yeah, I like the interaction. Well, it's not exactly the interaction, the observation of you as the older Lewis and Nicholas Ralph as the younger Lewis.
Yes.
I thought that was, again, just a marvelous way of doing it.
Thank you. Well, the point there is, Lewis is living in his memories. Mm-hmm. So, it's almost in that sense like Christmas Carol, where he looks back on a certain portion. And then what Norman Stone wanted to do was actually visualize me in the scene, but not seen, so that he can be observing, living alive in his memories in the movie.
Yeah, it made me think of that concept made me think of the Christmas Carol too.
Yes.
Now, one of the things I want to put a little bug in your ear about something. At the end, you quote quite a bit of The Weight of Glory. Have you ever considered recording that entire sermon?
I've done it publicly, and it's a big part of. And I'm actually going to Oxford next month for the Oxbridge conference, and I'm going to be reciting it there.
Oh, nice.
I think there are recordings of it. I don't know if we have the right to do it, but maybe we should seek them because we have rights to other things.
Mm-hmm. I would love to have a recording of that. And in all honesty, I can't imagine a better person doing it. So if you can manage to pull that off, I would appreciate it.
Well, I'd love to do it. And I actually love presenting it. I really do. In fact, the new play we do, Further Up, Further In, we close with a pretty big portion of it that really, I think, is profound. Not only do we want to see beauty, we want to be immersed in the beauty that we see, to bathe in it, to become part of it. That is why we people air and earth and water with gods and goddesses, the nymphs and elves, because though we cannot, these projections can enjoy in themselves the beauty, grace, and power that, and I can't remember the rest, but that's a big, big part of our close of Further Up, Further In.
Please remind me where Weight of Glory was originally delivered.
It was at St. Mary's Church in Oxford, the big church right on the high street there. It was an evensong. Supposedly, it was packed to the gills. People were sitting in the window sills. I actually, in 2014, I believe, I was invited to actually do the Weight of Glory in that church in the same pulpit. It's a risen pulpit, and very small, looking down at the congregation, and delivered it just the same place Lewis did.
Oh, that's great.
So we're getting short on time here. Tell us about your next projects, Further Up, Further In, any future films?
Yeah, we've got two. Further Up, Further In is going to start touring in September. I think we've got a touring schedule. We've been developing it for the last, we did a workshop in Houston and a preview in Phoenix, and it really, the audience response was fantastic. I was so pleased. So I look forward to doing that, and that's going to be coming in the fall around the country. And then we just signed a deal with Norman Stone to create two new C.S. Lewis films. One will the first film ended Christmas Communion 1931, when it really wasn't obvious that he would be, when he was converted in 1931, it wasn't obvious what kind of person he would be. Who knew he was going to become the most influential Christian writer of the 20th century? How did that happen? How did the BBC give him this platform, to speak to the nation? How did Hitler influence the writing of Screwtape Letters, things like that? And to show why he was such an amazing evangelist, particularly to skeptics, and give some examples of how he did that. Very excited about that. And we also want to take a look at his relationship with Jenny Moore, because that's been revealed now. He collapsed and was exhausted into exhaustion. Had to be hospitalized late in the 40s. So the second part would kind of look at his rise and kind of also a little bit his decline till about 1950, just prior to Narnia. Then the third part will be Narnia, Joy Davidman, Grief Observed, and we'll look very specifically at the last day of his life, November 22nd, 1963, when, he died in his bed of about within an hour of when Kennedy was assassinated. And so it's kind of interesting what was going on in the world and what was going on at the kilns. We want to look at that. And then we want to look at kind of post death. There's a very interesting story about Warney taking all these piles of papers and about ready to burn them, and Walter Hooper saving them from the flames. That we want to try to capture. Be fun to try to cast a modern day Walter Hooper.
Yeah. I assume you're familiar with Peter Kraft, Between Heaven and Hell.
I am. Yes. Yeah. So it's a fun book.
Yes.
Yeah, it actually launched his career.
Yeah.
As a published author. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know that you've got another appointment right about now, so we want to thank you so much for joining us. We're going to continue on and have some more conversation about C.S. Lewis, but I want to honor your time. I appreciate your willingness to join us, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Glenn, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, all three of you. Thanks so very much.
Yeah, great
God
to have
bless.
you, Max.
God bless.
Thanks for being with us. So we just had a great conversation with Max. And I think it'd be nice to reflect a little bit on some things that he said, maybe think a little bit about C.S. Lewis in particular, but maybe also the unique character of his conversion. I think Max in his remarks noted that for most of us, the thing that was the big hurdle was the moral question. Am I able to sort of own up to my sins, trust Christ as my atoning sacrifice, and believe that he's been raised. And that's kind of where it is. But with Lewis, it was a much more, I guess you could say, intellectual process. Not that it was like a dry, sort of kind of abstract process, but something else was going on. And, it reminded me a little bit of what I've read about Mortimer Adler's conversion. There's this intellectual component. There are these problems that have to be addressed in order for the conversion to occur. But the thing that's really kind of the key is not the ideas on their own. There is a reality that the intellectual is appraising and acknowledging, and that reality is God. So it's not so much a set of ideas in the head as it is there really somebody out there? That's the thing. And if there really is somebody out there, then that someone is God, then there are certain things that follow.
Yeah. What I found really interesting, and we ran out of time, I wanted to bring this up with Max, is when you watch the film, and if you haven't seen it, buy it, watch it, it's worth it. When Lewis gets off the train to meet his tutor, the Great Knock,
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
He makes a comment about he figures he should be saying something, and he says, "So Surrey is wilder than I had expected." And Knox says, basically, "Hold it. What do you mean by wilder? Are you commenting on the flora and the fauna and the geology? And where did you get these ideas? Did you read a book? Did you see photos? Why would you have expectations about what Surrey would look like?" And basically, in the space of a couple of minutes, he shreds Lewis's comment so much that he dismisses it as utterly meaningless. Now, the reason why that this time through that stuck with me, because one of the key arguments that brought Lewis out of his atheism was, where did you get this idea that the universe is unjust, that it is evil or anything like that? Where do you get this idea that pain is a bad thing, that evil is a bad thing? Where does this come from? It's exactly what Knock had done to him on his initial comment about Surrey.
Right.
If you force him to define it, where are these ideas coming from? Except in the second case, in the first case, they were completely unfounded. He was just trying to talk piffle. But in the second case, it becomes much more important because Lewis knew he could not dismiss the evil that he saw in the world, especially after World War I.
Well, think too about the pedagogical approach of the great Knock and how different it is from what teachers are encouraged to do in schools today. In schools today, if Lewis had said something like that, or someone like Lewis had said something like that in class, what would the teacher do? Praise the child.
Yeah,
for
affirm him,
or
her,
the
or
marvelous,
whatever it is.
Yeah. Right. For the marvelous insight that the child has, and isn't it marvelous that we can affirm your brilliance? And the Knock has no interest in any of that. He wants to get down to what's real, and he's sending a message to the child Lewis. You're not smart as smart as you think you are. You're not as socially adept as you think you are. I'm going to break you down. You're going to learn how to think. You're going to learn how to talk, and we're not going to put up with any nonsense.
Just a quick thing I found pretty fascinating in the film that I think is matched from my reading of Lewis. And this is the fact that for Lewis, the discovery of God and the coming to know God is over a lot of steps, almost like solving a mystery. And he discovers this book and he hears this idea. And all these little signs are pointing in this direction that he doesn't really come aware of until he finds himself actually having been pursued by God and then brought into grace. But it reminds me a lot of St. Augustine, a similar process of intellectual wrestling with these things, and these different signs like the children singing, open the book and read, become revelatory for him. And I really, really saw that kind of similarity going on, especially pronounced in this film.
Well, and part of it, too, is that his atheism was driven by the problem of evil. And in fact, that's the thing that kept Augustine from his mother's Christianity. It was the problem of evil. So, but with Lewis, there's some really interesting additional points. The idea of myth and things like that are very appealing to me. And I have to confess, the first time I read Surprised by Joy, I just felt like, man, I would have thrived with that kind of education. Yeah. I would have loved that.
Yeah.
But wrong decade, wrong country.
Right. Now concerning this project that Max and his company have, it's really intriguing to consider its appeal, its ability to connect with people, even, here going on 60 years after Lewis's death. And Lewis still speaks. In fact, his critics have been forgotten largely. And by the way, Lewis was not a guy who played the winsome card or tried the winsome technique. There are different stories that convey just how ruthless he could be, not just on the debate floor, but actually interpersonally with other world-class intellectuals. So Lewis was intimidated by no one. He would dress down people, in just different settings. And it's kind of hilarious to see the biting comments that he would employ to send a message to these other people.
I remember reading one story. I think it was with Walter Hooper, but an American in any event, who was visiting Lewis, and he asked Lewis if he could use his bathroom, and that's not a phrase that you use in England. So Lewis said, "Of course," and he took him to the room where there was a bath but no toilet.
Yeah,
and he gave him a towel and said, basically, have at it. And then the guy was looking sheepish, and Lewis just burst out laughing and said, "You want the toilet. Enough of these American euphemisms."
I came across an anecdote with A.I. Richards, the English literary critic that intellectually Lewis despised. But anyways, Lewis was actually charged with making sure that he was taken care of when he lectured at Oxford. He was there as a visiting, and so he was in charge of actually setting up sort of the accommodations for this guy. And so he gets him into some rooms, I think, at McLean College, and Lewis realizes that he has nothing to read before he goes to bed. So he goes back to his own study and retrieves his own copy of one of Richard's books. And that he walks in and he says, "Here's something that will put you to sleep." And he hands it to him. And then not only does he hand him his own book, but in the marginalia, there are all of Lewis's caustic comments about the stupidity of the arguments.
Right. Yeah. I was thinking about the marginal comments that must have been in there.
Yeah, and now here, giving credit to Richard, give credit to Richards. He actually signed the book and handed it back to Lewis. and in his
that's good.
And in his response, underneath his signature, he said something to the effect, "I wish I had heard these criticisms earlier. It would have been a better book." but that's the kind of guy we're talking about here, so but that's another thing to kind of keep in mind is when you get into the world of academia and when you're talking about the intelligentsia, there is just no tolerance or patience for niceties. Get to the point. Do you agree? Yeah. Don't you agree? Why? And that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And the really good academics, and there are some out there, the good ones, if you take them on, will be more than happy to listen and interact with you. And actually, in my experience, they'll sort of befriend you as a younger scholar.
Yeah.
If you've got the chutzpah to do that,
or at least respect you if the questions and the challenge are good.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember during my time of doctoral work in Oxford that there was still something of that. You go in and rip each other to shreds. But then you go to the pub afterwards. I mean, it was sort of, and then you oftentimes would continue the conversation and there were egos and people could have schools of thought where they didn't want to have much to do with the others. But on the whole, you had to see each other every week in seminars. So you had to learn both how to be vigorous, but also be friends with each other. I don't know if that's there anymore. I'd like to hope it is. I think a lot of universities here, it's all just become don't hurt my feelings or say anything that's politically incorrect because I can't handle having to argue for it because it's a social construct and not an intelligible, line of reasoning.
Yeah, in my doctoral work, the seminars consisted of starting off with a single book that you would be reading as sort of to set the stage for things, but then each person would develop a research paper and you had to present your research paper. And you distributed it a week ahead of time, and everybody then had a chance to go through it and shred it.
Yeah.
And so when you got together the next week, it was open season on your paper. And you learn very, very quickly not to make mistakes. You learn very quickly to be careful in your arguments and to document everything thoroughly. And you also develop a thick hide.
Yeah. Well, that
all of which is essential for an academic.
Yeah, or just a person who is able to reason well and argue for whatever. Rhetoric was considered a remarkably important discipline, not just because you want to go out into advertising, but because you wanted to be able to argue for the good, politically speaking, in forums in which there is a deliberation concerning what should our community do in light of this or that. So the idea was you need to know how to think logically. Then you need to know how to persuade. But the point was it wasn't to personally get ahead. The point was to actually help the political community work through just the challenges of that come along when any community is trying to live together or deal with the challenges that it faces from external forces. And this tendency that we have now to just take it easy on each other and care more about our feelings than whether or not the arguments are sound or the truth of the matter, I think reflects the fact that we're not in touch with reality. We're not actually dealing with what's in the best interest of us all. What we're dealing with is just personal little worlds and the subjective sense that each person has of their own well-being rather than thinking about anything bigger than that. Anyway, that's kind of gotten us off a track a little bit, but getting back to Lewis, Lewis didn't have any trouble with any of that.
Getting off the track is part of our MO.
That's right. Now, getting back to Max and what he's up to. There are shows that I've never actually been to one of the productions, but I've been aware of the productions. I know that he's got a presence there in New York and in Manhattan. So there's that, and that's great. And the richness of the material that he's working with is great. Kind of the question that a lot of folks struggle with is why can't we produce more people like Lewis? Why don't we see more sort of world-class intellects and so forth? Maybe that's unfair. Lewis is a freak in a certain way and a gift in another, person who in his own time was considered one of the greatest intellectuals in just the academy, not apologize. That was his sideline. That was sort of what he did with his spare time,
That's his hobby. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So maybe that's worth reflecting on. Is his education and the pedagogy that was in practice in the world that he came into adulthood in something that we need to recover? We talk a lot about classical education and its value, and that's certainly worthwhile. But what about this press for not just meeting standards? Because that's not really what it was about. It wasn't really about getting A's and getting a 4.0 and getting into the best school. That's not what they were really concerned with. They were concerned with the perfection of the potential of a student. And that's kind of behind the whole Oxford tutorial. So when, the weird thing here in America is we measure universities by how big they are. So if you're a state school and you have 60,000 students, people think that's significant. Whereas, where you're in a lecture hall and there are 300 students and you're lecturing to them. But the Oxford tutorial, it's one-on-one. There is no place to hide.
That's
You're
right.
you're sitting right in front of C.S. Lewis, and he is cross-examining you.
Yeah, they go
week.
over your arguments in work, and they force you to have to give an account for everything you say and why you say it, and they point out every grammatical mistake as well.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, yeah. So, what about that? Is this something we should be thinking about? I mentioned, I think, a couple of weeks ago, Montaigne or Montaigne, depends on how you want to say it, but in his essays, he argues that a tutor, a one-on-one tutor, so the great knock, is absolutely essential because a father or a mother will be too sympathetic to the child.
Yeah, and that's an old idea. It goes back to the Middle Ages. That goes back to the practice of fostering that we talked about in a previous episode on manners.
But this definitely had Lewis didn't think about the great knock and say, man, I hated that guy. He had a real affection for him.
Yeah.
And, some of the great knock appears in some of the stories, like, that hideous strength. One of the characters is based on the great knock.
Macpherson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is really useful about, there are a couple of things that have occurred with education. First of all, it's become highly specialized. You can get a degree. Actually, when I was at Michigan State decades ago, you could get a degree in packaging science about building boxes for moving stuff.
Right.
And I know people who do this for a living, and it is, it requires a lot of technical knowledge. But is that what the university is for? The two things that Lewis had that we don't are, first of all, this rigorous intellectual approach where you are challenged to defend everything that you are saying, number one. And number two, the broad base of reading that he did, the study, these kinds of things, working, started with Homer. Then I had to do Cicero and Demosthenes, the two great bores. Then Aeschylus, Euripides, and he's learning Greek and Latin during the day, and French, Italian, and German in the evening.
Nice.
But you're getting at something that I think many people in our listening audience wouldn't be aware of, and that's the effect of the PhD and how we can contrast that with the master's degree. So a lot of folks, they consider the master's degree just kind of the stepping stone to the PhD. That's a recent phenomenon. By the way, just so folks know, out in Pugcast land, C.S. Lewis did not have a PhD. Now, he got honorary doctorates afterwards, but he never had he was teaching at Oxford. He was a master, but he didn't have the PhD. The PhD is a narrowing of focus. Mm-hmm. So you become the world's authority on some absurd little data point. I actually knew a guy who was the world's authority on whether black letters on white background are more effective than white letters on black background or whatever. That was basically black letters on white versus white letters on black. He was the world authority on that. That was his PhD.
Yeah, there's an old saying that the process of education consists of learning more and more about less and less until you know absolutely everything about absolutely nothing.
But think about some of these other people that we have remarkable regard for. I mean, Tolkien didn't have a PhD. Niebuhr didn't have a PhD. Many of the great and many of the most influential intellectuals prior to Karl Barth, prior to 1970, they demonstrated their worth by what they wrote. And the mastery that they demonstrated of an entire sort of body of knowledge. That's what the master's degree is intended to, sort of prepare you to work with, is this entire discipline. So you have a master's degree in English. So that doesn't mean maybe just off the top of your head you can say everything that could be said about, say, Milton. But you have wherewithal to be able to go to do the deep dive anytime you want, because you know the major players, you know the major movements, and then you can work with it. I think that now both of you guys have PhDs. I was pursuing it and then just forfeited it. I just walked away. But I think you guys though agree with me that that's this sort of ability to kind of work with a wide range of things is something we see fewer and fewer people being able to do.
It's sort of interesting. When I did my doctorate at the University of Wisconsin, we had a thing that they called prelims. And in prelims, it was a 9-hour essay exam. You got 4 pieces of paper, each of which had 5 questions, and you had to answer 3. And they were on 4 different fields of history. In my case, early Central and late Middle Ages and Renaissance Reformation. They could ask you anything about that field that they wanted to. And any question is fair game. And the net result is you had to, in my case, I had 1,100 years of history, more or less, 1,200 maybe, in Europe that they could have asked me anything they wanted to about, period, no holds barred. And the net effect of this is my generation of people coming out of that program had a broad base of knowledge within history in our 4 fields. They've since dropped prelims. They don't do it anymore.
Wow.
Yeah. And
now with the prelims though, Glenn, was it written, oral, both?
Essay exam. You come in at 8 a.m, you're done at 5 p.m.
Yeah, and I think you have a lot of different things going on as well. I think a lot of the education in their generation received a much fuller and more intense bachelor's program, if you will, or the equivalent. And so what you end up having is a certain readiness. Now, the U.S., for example, for a long time, hasn't had a bachelor's degree you can do in divinity or theology. So you have to do a MDiv, which only introduces you to some classes. Then in my case, I went on and did a THM to kind of intensify that. And because theology is so big, really getting a doctorate was just a stepping stone into being able to become conversant in a bit of a wider and yet specialized area. And for example, there was a lot of stuff that hadn't been translated into English. And so you had to do a lot of the languages and the prep work. And then you could finally write on it, and it would actually bring new scholarship to the field. But I think the education was very different. They would have been able to do this much earlier because their preparatory schools and their first degree would have covered what it takes much longer to do in the time in the programs when I went into them.
I spoke to somebody from Britain. He was a professor at University of Leicester. And what we concluded is that European education is front-loaded, American education is back-loaded. So an American PhD is as good as a European PhD, and arguably in some cases better. There are all kinds of variables here, but a European bachelor's is probably going to be much more, or even the equivalent of the high school diploma is going to be a whole lot more intense than what we get here.
Right. Now, getting back to Lewis and Max and what we had the privilege of talking to Max about, we probably should sort of kind of bring kind of this portion of our time with our audience here to a close and then transition into a question and answer format. But is there anything you wanted to say as we wrap up, Glenn, particularly related to Max and what he's doing with the most reluctant convert, but maybe more broadly?
Yeah, I think that Max is what he's doing with the Fellowship of Performing Arts, all of the shows, whether it's plays or theater, is a great example of something Lewis said. He said, we don't need more Christian writers. We need more good writers who are Christian. In other words, we just need people doing things from a Christian worldview, but producing excellence, producing quality in writing. When you look at most Christian films, they're schlock. And that's the polite word here.
Sure.
The Most Reluctant Convert is an excellent film. It is, it is just extraordinarily well done on every level. The plays are extraordinarily well done. And so what you're getting here is quality performing arts on stage and on film that promote a biblical worldview, but do it in a way that exudes excellence, and that I think even secular critics would look at these things and say, that was really well done. And it's got a lot of interesting ideas.
Right.
I think that we, by producing a lot of bad Christian films that at best are thinly disguised versions of the four spiritual laws, or that only appeal to sort of in-house things, preaching to the choir, I think we're doing ourselves a real injustice. The artistic quality of these things speak for themselves, and I think we'll do much better at reaching a larger audience. Even if you're just thinking about it in terms of bringing people to consider the claims of Christ, this will work a lot better than any other Christian films I've seen. So I think that this is just really important stuff. That's sort of the bottom line because of what it is doing and how well it is doing it.
Yeah, I agree with you completely, Glenn. But let me just note that sometimes there are people who take that observation that some of the work that's been produced in, Christian storytelling, whether it's through novels or films, is kind of schlocky. To justify, they've used that argument to justify maybe things that are edgy in ways that a person like C.S. Lewis would not have been pleased to see. So in other words, they say, well, this is unrealistic over here, so we're going to get really graphic and ugly. But when we think about what Lewis produced, what Tolkien produced, it's wholesome, it's uplifting, it's beautiful, it deals with realities that are unpleasant, but not in a way that is gratuitous, not in a way that just titillizes or sort of appeals to sort of a need to be gritty or something like that. There's always a reason. So it's sort of like this, like when you think about comedians, a lot of comedians basically, with their edginess, get nervous laughter, and then they work with that. Really good comedians don't need the edgy, nervous laughter. They just say funny things, and they can be very wholesome in terms of how they approach their craft of making people laugh. And what's harder? I think it's harder to be clean and funny than it is to be edgy and sort of graphic and supposedly funny. You appeal to a wider audience, but also there's a kind of, I think, an intelligence and a subtlety that's at work in the person who's appealing to a larger audience. In other words, it's kind of a cheap trick to do the low road, and so it's not just that we want to be real in the sense that we want to show blood or we want to show whatever. What we want is really artful and thoughtful presentations that deal with what's true and good and beautiful, as we talked about many times.
Yeah. Right. And all of the things that Fellowship of Performing Arts do are built around ideas.
Yeah.
They're not built around the kind of edgy or gratuitous stuff. They're built around ideas, and that's part of the quality.
Right. So anyway, as we wrap up, Tom, is there anything you want to say as we conclude this portion of our time?
No, it was a great film to watch. I kind of agree with everything Glenn just said there. It was great having him come and share a bit with us as well, and I encourage anyone to check it out. It's well worth it.
Okay. Anything you want to say as we close this portion of things, Glenn?
I think I've already said it.
All right. Well, we thank you for listening to the Theology Pugcast. We appreciate your support. People support us in lots of ways. Sometimes people share, their enthusiasm for the show with people they know, and that leads to more people listening to the show, and that's great. Sometimes people rate the show, and that helps as well for lots of reasons. They give us, 5 stars or whatever. And then there are even people who manage to give us money on a monthly basis in different ways. There's the Fight, Laugh, Feast Network. We appreciate that. There are other ways that people support us financially, and those gifts really do make a difference because they actually do pay the bills. There are bills in producing the show. But anyway, that's enough for now. We are grateful, as I said, and we look forward to seeing you, or at least having you hear us next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.